Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Praful. As Ranjit said, I am the founder of CoinEarth, your next portfolio company. And the key product that we have built over the last couple of years is called marketsn.com. You can check out the website. I'll talk briefly about what we do at MarketsN in the later half of the talk. But the focus today is taking the audience through blockchain as a technology and its application in enterprises, right? And the agenda really is that by the end of this call, you should be able to answer or at least have answers to the following questions, like what a blockchain is, what is its importance in the digital enterprise, how is it different from a traditional database or a workflow engine, and how can you actually consider using it in your startup or organization, right? That's broadly what we are looking to cover, right? And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to start with historical perspective. I'm going to take you all the way back to 2008 when this technology is born. And the first half of the talk would be almost a historical perspective of this. And then in the second half of the call, we will kind of switch our gears and start talking about applications. I'll show you a couple of real world case studies and some potential applications that we are looking at. Right, so that's what we are going to do this. And the story really starts in 2008. Right, some of you, I guess all of you will remember global financial crisis when a lot of the large financial houses in US, starting in US, then all over the world came down. And there was extreme mistrust in the large financial institutions in 2008. Right, the Wall Street movement started there. And it was in this context that this paper was published. Right? This is the first page of the paper that came out. The paper that I'm talking about is, of course, Bitcoin. And what the paper was trying to do was that it said, I want to create a monetary system, or I want to create an electronic cash system where one party can send money to another party without going through a financial institution. Right? Now take a minute to think about what the problem is and what the context is. The context is 2008, and that's, you can understand why this problem is being set up like this, where there's a distrust in financial institutions, and you're kind of saying, we don't trust them. Why should all my financial transactions be intermediated by a bank? Right? And if you think about it, if you have to transfer money between any two parties today, and you don't want to use cash, we'll come to cash in a minute, but forget cash for a minute. And if you are not in the same geographical location, then you must go through a bank. There is no other way to solve this problem today. Whether it's UPI, Beam, credit card, debit cards, banks, there has to be a financial institution in the middle. And in the context, the paper was set up saying, can we kind of solve this problem where I don't want a financial institution intermediating the flow of transactions between companies? It turns out it's a fairly hard problem. And this was not the first time that this was being attempted. Several attempts in the past had been made and all of them had failed. Right? But this paper actually combined three known technologies: digital signatures, transaction hashes, and a new data structure, the chain of transaction records. And it used these and combined them to solve the problem. Right? And to understand how they did it, a little bit of that, we'll have to go back and answer a more fundamental question about what really is money. Right? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to just absorb the question, because it's not a question that we face every day. What is money? Right? And to motivate you to think slightly more about it, I'm going to flash this picture in front of you and draw your attention to this statement here. I promise to pay the bearer the sum of 100 rupees, and it has been signed by the RBI governor. Right? Now, my question to you is, if you take this piece of paper and give it to the RBI governor, what will he or she give to you?
In earlier times, it would have been 100 rupees worth of gold,
Correct.
but that went for a toss many years ago.
Correct.
So what you will get is essentially another 100 rupee note.
Correct.
Or maybe a new note.
Right? Another 100 rupee note. You will actually take this and give it to you. Right? So you're absolutely right, Girish. In the 1960s, this connection between gold reserves and this piece of paper was broken, right? And that was the first huge change in the monetary system, decoupling money from gold, right? And if you think about it today, money really is a human creation, right? It does not exist in nature. The fundamental reason it was created was to enable trade, right? Because barter does not scale. And today we use money as a medium of exchange, as a standard of value, as well as a store of value, right? Another interesting thing, the first big thing is the decoupling between money and gold. The second big thing, and this also maybe a lot of you understand, but perhaps some of you don't, that money is not cash. Okay, so if you look at the picture on the right, this is a historical view of the total money supply in the world, right? And the total cash in the world is the blue mountain at the top, at the bottom. This is the cash. The total amount of money is at the top. So most money is not cash today, which brings me to perhaps the most important part that I want to cover in the first 10 minutes, that cash is something physical. It's a piece of paper. Money today is just bits. Okay, and money exists today only as a ledger entry in a bank. When you say my account has 1 lakh rupees, what that means is that you have registered in a bank, they have written down your name and identity and put 1 lakh in front of it, and that's what money is. Money is just bits today. Now keep that definition in mind and go back to what the problem statement was in the Bitcoin paper. What they were trying to do was to create a system where money could be sent from one party to another without going through a financial institution. And since money today is just ledger entries, to create this money, they had to create a ledger. And since they did not want this money to be controlled by a financial institution, by implication, the design was that we need to design a ledger which is not controlled by banks. But if you have a money ledger which is not controlled by banks, then $1 million question was, who should maintain this ledger? Okay.
Praful, a quick question on the previous slide. Maybe I didn't read it. Just go back to that, please. Yeah, I didn't see. What are the other? So the bottom is cash, the blue. What are the other forms? The other colored ones here.
Okay, so there are various forms. The simplest one is, here is the way to think about it. Let's suppose everybody in Bangalore today goes to the banks that are in Bangalore and says, I want to withdraw all my bank balance. There is not enough cash in Bangalore to support that.
Correct.
Extrapolate that and say if every bank holder in India goes to all the banks in India and says, give me my money in cash, there is not enough cash in the world in Indian rupees to satisfy that. So therefore, money is definitely great. The total amount of money supply is much, much greater than the total amount of cash supply, because money is just in a ledger.
Correct.
Right? That's
but do these colors indicate anything?
Yes, they do. So in economics and finance, there are different kinds of monies, M1, M2, M3. Some of them take the form of money. Some of them take the form of even government bonds. Right? Even government bonds are considered a form of money.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Right. So coming back to this idea of the problem that was being solved in this paper, what they were trying to do was create a money system which was not intermediated by banks. Remember the 2008 financial crisis? And they realized that to create money which was not intermediated by banks, they needed a ledger which was not controlled by banks. And the $1 million question was, if not the bank, then who? Right? And they could not really rely on any central entity, because if they did, they would be back to square one, which was that entity would become corruptible and the growing distrust and financial ecosystem would sustain. So the answer they came up with was no one. Right? Another way of saying this, that anyone. So they designed a public ledger which was not controlled by anyone, or you can say it another way, a public distributed ledger maintained by anyone who wants to join the network. And that ledger is what we are here to talk about. That ledger is called blockchain. So blockchain is to this new form of money, which is cryptocurrencies, as bank ledgers are to money. Just like money is created entries in bank ledgers, just like bank ledgers record transactions of money, same way cryptocurrencies are creating by added entries in blockchains. Blockchains maintain the ledger of transactions, and they are the ledger in which these transactions are maintained. And with this, so if you look at what they achieved, was traditional money used to be created, stored, transacted in a ledger, which was maintained by an institution which was called the bank. They created a new form of money, which was maintained not by one entity, by anybody who wanted to join the network, and there was no institution. Right? So if you look at this history and now ask what is blockchain, you have the first definition that a blockchain is a public ledger or a database which is maintained jointly by multiple entities to record cryptocurrency transactions. Since there are many copies, the underlying technology ensures that all ledger copies are synchronized in real time and all transactions are digitally signed so that nobody can dispute the security or the sanctity of the transaction. Let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions before I move on to the next part of the journey. What I've described to you is the foundation of the technology till now in 2008.
So, Praful, why are we calling it only cryptocurrency transactions? I'm assuming this is because for this session only, right? Otherwise, blockchain can record any transaction, right? Maybe it can be a legal transaction between two parties.
Right. So that brings me to blockchain 2.0, right? Now I'm talking about 2014. In 2014, exactly what you said happened. The realization that why should this database, which has all these nice properties, should be used to record only cryptocurrency transactions? Why can't I record any transaction on this ledger? And this is the time that blockchain starts to break away from crypto as its own world.
Okay.
Now, what can you record? This is the time, if you go back and kind of read the newspapers and magazines from this data, this era, what can you do? What kind of transactions can you record in this ledger if not cryptocurrency? And all kinds of ideas came forward. You can have land registries, right? Because a land is an asset. Just like a cryptocurrency or money is an asset, a land is an asset. So ownership of land as an asset, transactions of land as an asset can be recorded in registries, right? Then you have vehicle registries, right? Even today when we buy a car, we go to the RTO and register our car, right? So we are used to this idea that somebody needs to maintain this registry, especially for valuable assets, as to who owns what. And even though the technology was born to handle cryptocurrency transaction, by 2014, we were breaking away from cryptocurrency and saying any kind of transaction can be recorded in this kind of ledger. Okay. Any thoughts, questions, comments before I move on? There are two more stages. I'll talk to you about blockchain 3.0 and finally 4.0, and then we will talk about applications and
You will cover, Praful, how the integrity of this data is maintained. Other than having a distributed copy of it everywhere, how the integrity is maintained. If you are covering it down the line, then that's fine.
Actually, I'm not going to cover it. That gets slightly technical, but I can speak for it for about a couple of minutes to answer that question. The answer is hidden in the first slide where I said it is a combination of 3 key tricks, right? The 3 key tricks in maintaining the sanctity is in digital signatures, transaction hashes, and chain of transaction records. So let me take a minute and mention each one of these. A digital signature is what you see if you have gotten a Form 16 from your employer, right? There's a green check mark at the bottom that appears, which says that this is a valid document. That is what a digital signature is. It verifies the sanctity of the data of the document that you are holding in your hand, and it uses something called public key cryptography. Okay, so that is where you should think about digital signature. A transaction hash is the underlying idea that you can create a fingerprint of a document, which means that you can take all the data that exists in any kind of a document and create a unique fingerprint of it, so that if even one bit in the primary document is modified, the hash will be corrupted, and if you try to calculate the hash from a modified document, the hash will not match. This is again goes back to sanctity of the data that is being stored, right? And finally, the idea that you can create a chain of transaction records. And this is really the beauty of it, where you take digital signatures and create a chain of it, so that the older the data becomes in the blockchain, the harder it is to modify, because to be able to modify it without the consensus of everybody who's maintaining the ledger requires more and more computational power, because you add the signature, the transaction hash of all the signatures, or transaction hash of all the transactions in the past, you add it to the new data set, and you build a chain or a link of transaction hashes, so that the security keeps growing stronger and stronger over time. Right? But that is
Okay. Understand.
I have a question here. So,
Sure.
Praful, like all these transactions are happening on some public infrastructure. Okay, we understand that there is no particular institution which owns this public infrastructure. So, in actuality, who is owning this infrastructure? There are computer systems which has to be owned by someone. And what are their interest of owning those systems?
Okay, so let me answer both the questions. Who is owning this network? So here's the best way to think about it. You can download a piece of software on your laptop and connect to this network, and you will become one of the nodes in the network, and you will get a copy of the ledger. And like you, anybody in the world can do this. Right now, depending on which blockchain you're talking about, anywhere between 10,000 to 15,000 nodes have connected and built the underlying multiple entities or nodes which form the public network on which this ledger is being maintained, right? So that is part one of the answer. Part two of the answer is, why the hell are they doing this? Okay, that is where the incentives come in. The way the ecosystem is set up is the philosophy of, and I did not talk about it because that starts to go into crypto, but let me give you the idea. See, if you think about how do banks make money, they basically charge you for providing a service. In a very similar spirit, the system is set up in such a way that if you connect your laptop to this network, they count you as 1/10,000 of a bank. Let's suppose there are 10,000 nodes in the bank. So they will count you as 1/10,000 of a bank. And when they charge transaction fee for transactions, you will get a share of that transaction fee. So what is you joining this network? The argument is that if as more and more people start using this network, you will start to get a share of the benefit.
Okay, good one.
Any other questions, Bishop, before I move on?
Is there something called a critical network health of like what's the minimum number of nodes like that makes it a good enough data?
Right. So it's a good question. I would hold off to the answer for about 5 minutes. The answer is let me just hold off to that answering that question for 5 minutes, because you will see in blockchain 4.0 something interesting will happen.
Got it. Thank you.
So, Praful, just out of curiosity, let's say nowadays there are so many exchanges where you can actually go and buy the cryptocurrency, right? So the digital signatures are handled by the exchanges, and you just make an account on a UI, and all of those are handled on the backend side by the exchanges. Is that correct?
That is correct. So even though the original design was that every single person who joins the network can host a copy of the ledger, there are service providers who have emerged which says, well, there are already 10,000, 15,000 nodes. By all means, if you want to use RAM and disk on your machine to connect to the network, by all means. But if you don't want to do that, we are one of the nodes maintaining this, and you can access the system via us.
Hmm.
Right? So there is a bottleneck that you have added because it's not completely decentralized. Not every node, not every user is a node. You have decoupled the connection between a user and a node. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Let me move on. Now let me talk to you about blockchain 3.0. This is now around 2015-16. This paper comes out from Ethereum yellow paper. And what they do is they change the word database and they say a digital platform. Okay. So everything stays the same. It's a public platform maintained jointly by multiple entities to record transactions. All ledger copies are synchronized. All transactions are digitally signed. But why and how do we move from a database to a digital platform? This is where the best way to understand this is with the notion of what we call conditional transactions. Right? So let me explain what that means. A transaction is a transfer of value, which means Let's suppose Girish wants to give me 100 rupees. So Girish will transfer 100 rupees to me. That's a transaction. But let's suppose we say I want a conditional transaction. What does a conditional transaction means? You write a program which says, or you record in the ledger the following statement: Girish promises to pay 100 rupees to Praful if something happens. Now this is a conditional transaction, and you can record this on the blockchain. And this thing is called a smart contract. So you can think of these as conditional transaction, where the conditions can be programmed by application developers and solution providers. So for example, this is where we do most of our work. We kind of have built a whole ecosystem around these smart contracts. But coming back to this, a smart contract is fundamentally a conditional transaction where the conditions are programmed and the enforcement of the contract terms are done without management. Because all the nice properties, because it is jointly by multiple parties, so no party can.
Hey, Praful, just let me request everyone to put themselves on mute. There's some noise coming on the here.
Sure. Okay, so as I was saying, the big shift that happens from 2.0 to 3.0 is that we move from a database to a digital platform. Now, people who come from computer science and databases will immediately recognize these as stored procedures idea, now implemented in a distributed ledger, because you could start writing executable code inside the platform in a database, and that is what exactly happens in 3.0. The difference is the other properties stay the same, which means even though now you have an execution engine, this execution engine, which is now a digital platform, is maintained not by one party, but by multiple parties. All ledger copies are synchronized and all transactions are digitally signed, which means that once the conditional transaction has been written into the blockchain, and once the conditions are met or not met, the conditional transaction will execute on its own and will transfer the value as agreed upon in the conditional transaction. And this is what happens with smart contracts. They allow the transfer of the execution of transactions between two parties without two parties necessarily requiring on each other to execute a contract. And this is where you will hear the term trust. You will hear the term trust coming very often. In principle, the extreme argument is that two parties in green and blue who don't even know each other can enter into a contract on a blockchain and be assured that the contract will be executed as agreed upon. And that's where you will hear the term trustless transactions or trustless economy. That is what they are talking about. Okay. So pause here. Any questions, thoughts, comments before I move on? Otherwise, the last part of the history in 4.0, and then I move into applications. Okay.
This is good, quite lucid.
Cool. So let me move on. So now we move on to 4.0. And in 4.0, what happens is we cut out the word public. Okay. And we say, why should it be public? Why cannot a group of entities come together and create a shared digital platform, right? And this is the advent of enterprise blockchains. This starts around 2016-17, when early permission blockchains start to make their appearance. And the idea is that instead of having it open to everyone, can I create like a private network? I don't need 10,000 nodes. And this was the question that somebody asked earlier. Can I have a blockchain of 2 nodes or 3 nodes or 4 nodes? Absolutely. This is where smaller number of nodes start to come in, and they start creating these private networks or permission networks where not anybody can join. So you join by invitation only. And why would you want to do that? Well, you start to create a platform for secure cross-enterprise collaboration, right? And that is 4.0, which started in 2016-17. And then since then, we have seen very interestingly, a technology which started by being an anarchical technology and saying we don't trust financial institutions. A lot of the enterprise and financial institutions kind of morphed the technology into enterprise blockchain, which became useful and powerful for them, and which is what I'll talk about. But this is the history of blockchains.
Hey, Praful, 2 questions. One is, how do you make sure you're not an inadvertent party to a transaction? That, you know, you get up one day, you look in your garage and your car has been sold, right? I'm just raising one, right? And the other is, did hash graphs solve or try to solve something similar to blockchain 4.0?
So the first answer is slightly tricky to the first one. The first one is the answer difference between blockchain and private blockchain. In the private blockchain, that question, the answer is no, you cannot do that, because invitation is by permissions only, and identity is well controlled inside a permission blockchain. In a public blockchain, things are much more messier, because the whole notion of identity is very fluid in a public blockchain. How do you uniquely identify somebody in a public blockchain is not clear. Now I'll tell you what is happening in the public blockchain world. The public blockchain itself has no notion of a human, right? All it knows is an account. So it says this is an entity. Whether that entity is a bot or a human or an enterprise or a bank or a government, the public blockchain doesn't care. It identifies you with a unique hexadecimal number, kind of like an account number. And everything that is recorded on the blockchain, you are identified by that number. So, this feature is also called pseudo-anonymity, which means, yes, it's a public ledger where all transactions are visible to everyone. And you know that transaction was made between account 1 and account 2, but you don't know who the real world identity is behind that account. And that is called a feature of a blockchain called pseudo-anonymity. Having said that, as regulations are happening, the gateways like decentralized exchanges where you can potentially go and buy and sell cryptocurrency have been regulated by the governments in which they are operating to say that you must do a KYC to ensure the identity. And therefore, with the KYC data, you could, combined with the blockchain data, find out who did what transaction, right? So that is the identity question. So things, and to your question, your car has been registered in somebody else's name. Can something like that happen on a public blockchain? Well, here is the issue, right? What do you mean the register, it has been registered? Which registry are you talking about? If you are talking about a public blockchain registry, anybody arbitrarily can create a registry and claim that car. But does that registry have legal sanctity by the government in which that car is located? If the answer is no, that registry is useless, right? So the registry makes, if you are talking about legal ownership of a certain asset, you need to have regulatory blessing for that, right? Of hash graphs, yes, hash graphs try to do something like enterprise blockchains. Enterprise blockchain, remember, is not a technology. There are several platforms which offer enterprise blockchain solutions. For example, we work on something called Hyperledger Fabric. The another one is R3 Corda, and yet another one is Consensus or Private Ethereum or Quorum, right? All of these are platforms, and Hashgraph is yet another platform for enterprise blockchains.
Praful, this is Venkat. So central banks have gotten into the game, as you know, and from enterprises to central banks and decentralized finance, DeFi. Would you call that blockchain 5.0, or it's just a evolution of 4.0?
So that's a great question. So as far as CBDCs are concerned, central bank digital currencies, they will be blockchain 4.0 because they will be private networks. Okay. Now DeFi is very interesting. Okay, DeFi will virtually be 5.0, Venkat. What's happening is, what we're saying is that even though the asset is being registered on the permission blockchain, let's say the asset is a car, or the asset is an invoice, or the asset is a manufacturing machine that I own, even though the asset's validity is registered on the permission blockchain, I'm using the crypto world to finance or borrow against it. That is DeFi. That is the concept. We ourselves have some work on it. But it's still early days. It is not part of the deck today, but DeFi would be 5.0 because it combines the enterprise blockchain with public blockchain.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right. Any other questions before we move on, folks?
Praful, I'm not sure if you're talking about this later, but a quick summary of the economics of smart contracts may help. For example, what is a gas, Ethereum gas, and typically how do you use it, or what is the economic impact of applicability of some of running these smart contracts?
Sure. So let me talk about that. The big difference between 2.0 and 3.0, right? If you go between 2.0 and say, what did we do? We took a ledger which was created for cryptocurrency transactions and used it to record new transactions. So you were recording these transactions, but fundamentally this was still a registry which was recording ownership and transactions. What happened with 3.0 is that the world became programmable. Okay. And in fact, in 2015, when economists covered this, they called it the universal computer. Right? What was happening was that you had a digital platform which was public, which was secure, which was verifiable, and which could be programmed because the conditions in the transaction could be programmed. Another big way of thinking about it for those of you who come from finance, think of this as starting with the initial idea was that you could have a programmable escrow. That was another term that you would hear, programmable escrow. But then this really exploded because you said, what all kinds of applications can I deploy on using this idea of smart contracts on the public blockchain? And that's where this whole application business started. Now, go back to a question that was asked earlier, right? Why should I host a node and connect to this network and become 1/10,000th of a bank? Okay. Why should I do that? I'm using computation power, I'm paying electricity, I'm paying the network bandwidth, right? So, and I told you initially that the incentive that was offered to them was that any transaction that would be done by any party, you would get a share of the benefits. Now turn around the other way and say, let's suppose you are an enterprise company or a company offering solution on top of public blockchain, and you deploy this smart contract on the public blockchain. Now, what happens is when you deploy a smart contract on the public blockchain, it is considered a transaction like any other transaction. Or if your smart contract actually executes a transaction. Now think about what that means. When you say my smart contract is executing a transaction, remember all the 10,000 nodes have to execute a transaction and update the ledger in sync. So there's a lot of computation that is going on. So when you deploy a smart contract or when your smart contract executes a transaction on the public blockchain, you are asked to pay a fee. And that fee has to be paid in a cryptocurrency specified by the public blockchain. That is how you create the demand for that currency. So you have to pay the fee in that cryptocurrency, and that fee is called gas. Gas is the price that you pay to execute a transaction on the public blockchain. It is the fee that a smart contract pays to do a transaction on the public blockchain. It's a fee that startups like ours have to pay if we have to deploy our solution on the public blockchain, and that gas has to be paid in cryptocurrency. Does that answer the question?
Praful, time to get into the applications from your side now.
Okay. All right. So let me start here. When we talk about enterprise blockchain, the best way to think about this is that they enable cross-enterprise digital platforms. Okay. Now, if you look at this idea, cross-enterprise digital platforms have the potential to work across industries. I will leave this slide on for 30 seconds. Depending on which industry you work in or is closest to your heart, you will realize that in any industry, there are multiple companies which have to come together to deliver value to the end customer. In automotive, for example, there's an OEM, there might be a fleet operator, there might be an insurance provider, a bank, right? There might be a regulatory body, and so on and so forth. In industrial projects, that might be a manufacturing company, the mines might be separate, banks are a separate entity, logistics are a separate entity. So whenever you think of enterprise blockchain, you should think of where is the potential for a cross-enterprise digital platform, right? Now, the big impact of a cross-enterprise digital platform, I know a lot of you come from data and machine learning and AI background, so I just put together this slide for you kind of to relate to it. The key transformation is that data, which was initially treated as an enterprise asset, you should now think of data as a shared asset among enterprises. If we are able to create data as a shared asset among enterprises, what will that enable? Let me give you some examples, right? The way we enable data as a shared asset among enterprises is by creating these cross-enterprise digital platforms, and that is what we are showing here, a cross-enterprise digital platform which looks like an orange donut, where each one of these is a separate organization which comes this network. Note that there is no center. Each one of these guys can potentially host their own node and create a private blockchain and share data among themselves. Right? Now, why would you want to do that? Let's look at some example. In manufacturing, inventory data is extremely valuable to be shared across enterprises. Imagine if an OEM or a manufacturing company has visibility into the inventory data of tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, how much would they be able to unblock their cash flow and the inventory levels, right? Now, once you have inventory data, why not put an algorithm on top of it by the company itself and start sharing inventory and demand forecasts between companies, right? If you are in the fintech or bank, then imagine the power of a bank having access to an authentic transaction record of the borrowing entity so that they're able to evaluate their risk profile, right? This is now being called flow-based financing because the argument is that a bank or an NBFC has visibility into the transactions through a secured sharing platform between different enterprises. And once you do that, you can extend this saying, if I have a transaction data, can I project it out using algorithms and have projected cash flows and risk scores, right? Third example that I would cite is insurance, right? Typically, the manufacturer and the buyer have access to the asset data, but what if we could have this shared securely with an insurance company, which could build a model which is customized and hopefully lower premium? You can have projected usage-based insurance model and risk score models. So the big idea really is that when you have cross-enterprise digital platforms where data can be shared, then you really kind of open up the multiple different applications in the enterprise space, right? And that's what we do. Markets-N, as I mentioned, is the product that we have built. This is the mobile snapshot, which is coming out very soon. Right now, we support the desktop version. But fundamentally, what Markets-N enables you to do is to create these digital ecosystems on demand. You can create secure private B2B groups on demand. So for example, here I'm showing you a group which you have created or your organization has created and added 8 other member organizations. And this becomes a shared digital ecosystem between your entities. This will remind you of a WhatsApp-like idea where you're forming these groups, but these groups are formed between companies. This is another group you have formed with 12 other organizations. Here is another group you have formed with 9 other organizations. But when you create these groups on our Markets-N platform, we spin up a private blockchain for you between those organizations. We don't control the data. We are just the enablers of the platform, and it's a decentralized permission blockchain that we set up for you. Who is in the private group is completely up to the enterprise, right? So you can create multiple groups. Each group is private and data is not shared across groups. The second thing that we have done is we have pre-built workflows using smart contracts. And these smart contracts allow the member organizations in the group to not only share data with themselves, but also coordinate operations between themselves. So what you kind of end up with is a digital cross-enterprise platform for real-time B2B coordination and shared visibility, right? Now, let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions on this. Otherwise, I'll talk to you about something that Ranjit mentioned, NFT, which is also getting a lot of press these days. And I'll talk to you about how we are using NFTs. Okay, so there are no questions. Now, let me talk to you about this one. This has been something that actually we have been working on for more than a year. We released it less than a month ago, and we got some good press coverage because of this. NFT stands for non-fungible token. Think of non-fungible token as another kind of an asset that can be registered and traded and secured on the blockchain. I'll not go too much into it. But what we have done with enterprise NFTs is created this idea of a digital product passport, right? For example, here I'm showing you the digital product passport of a car, right? Now, some things to note here. Note that this product is shared with you organization and 3 other organizations. So multiple organizations are looking at that product passport, right? Since this button is turned on, a hash of this data is also pushed to the public blockchain, and that is what becomes an NFT. So think of NFT as a digital representation of this vehicle on the public blockchain as assured by these 4 organizations. So the assurance that this is the right data comes from the 4 organizations which have kind of created this digital passport together, right? Why would you want to do something like this? Well, think about the one value proposition is that you can have contextual data sharing. So for example, for this particular vehicle, the manufacturer, the financier, the insurance, the buyback, the service provider have all shared visibility into this, and they have the right to modify different parts of it. So if an insurance company settles a claim on this, they can write onto the product passport saying that I have fulfilled the insurance claim on this. Or if a service provider fulfills a warranty claim, they can write warranty claim into this. If an OEM has a connected vehicle, they can update the odometer reading. Why do you want to do that? Well, remember that what you are trying to do is now with this, you're trying to create a certified, auditable, cradle to grave product trail. This has use cases, for example, in the resale value of the car. If you have a trusted, auditable history of the car signed off by the financier, the insurance, and the service provider, that improves the resale value of the car and reduces the total cost of ownership for the customer. Right? We are also starting to see use cases where, because government is now getting, at least in the Western governments, are getting more serious about environmental and sustainable compliance. Can we, inside the product passport, can we embed recycling criteria and ensure who is the recycler and record in the passport itself where this product was recycled? And this helps manufacturers deal with what are called extended producer responsibilities, so that they ensure that the product that they built was in fact recycled properly. There are other use cases which we are kind of working on. This one is more recent with a Korean company, which is trying to actually monetize the data by selling the data to a bank. And there are some interesting models here where a product can become a service with pay-as-you-go models. But the underlying idea is this enterprise NFT shared across multiple organizations, still trustable because any update is digitally signed by the enterprises which together created this NFT. Let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions before I move on.
Hey, Praful, Ranjit here. So if one of those organizations was actually, let's say, my dealership service shop, and another organization was a non-dealership service shop. So in fact, then not only would I have a record of the purchase of the car, but also of the service log of the car, all in one place. Is that feasible?
That's absolutely not only feasible, that is exactly what happens. That is what our platform does. It allows multiple enterprises to write into the car who are authorized to write into the passport.
Okay. So the multiple enterprises that are accessing this and already do have access, let's say, right? So somebody needs to be responsible to manage that as well, right? For example, manage disputes in this case, right? The physical representation of the car, let's say the car is red, but one of the organization puts blue in this case, right? Now, physically, when the customer goes to buy it and looks at, okay, this is red. Now, who owns the how do you resolve the dispute in this case?
Okay.
Do you remove the access of one of the organizations from the platform, or what do you do around?
Okay, so the first question is, what do you mean by you? Okay.
Yeah.
So let's delve deeper into this. Remember the way MarketSend, and now I'm going to talk about MarketSend as a platform. MarketSend allows you to create these groups and allows enterprises to create these groups. So in this group, this passport is shared between 4 organizations. Right? Now, the way we solve the problem is that we say you can have all 4 member organizations as an equal participant in the group, right? Or you can have 2 kinds of roles. You can have administrator organization and non-administrator organizations in the group. Pretty much like in WhatsApp, you have group administrators and non-group administrators. The difference between administrators and non-administrators is that administrators, one, host a copy of the ledger. So they host that peer or the node, which is key to the blockchain. And second, they have the right to control the permissions as to who is part of this blockchain and who is not part of this blockchain group, right? So that permission is not on CoinEarth or Praful. It is on the group administrator who decides what to add and what to remove. That is the answer to the membership question. But keep in mind that one of the advantages of the blockchain technology is what we call non-deniability. So if somebody comes and says that the car is, if one of the authorized, okay, so let me break it down into a party which is not authorized to write into the product passport cannot write into the product passport, One. Two, a party which is authorized to write into the product passport can write into the passport, but by definition, it will be digitally signed. Any action on the platform is digitally signed. So later on, they cannot deny that they wrote this. And third, they can always be kicked out if they are not the administrator.
So I think you answered it 90%. Just the 10% that I had a doubt was, see, this began with a system where you need to trust, right? And let's say if you are still able to pinpoint that an authorized transaction has been gone through and it was in, let's say, not connected with the physical reality or something like that, does it stand any legal ground in terms of, let's say, a legal action can be taken on that? Because contractual agreements do kind of have a provision for that. Would these stand a chance in that case?
Okay, so so the question that you're asking is probably more better answered in this construct, the smart contracts, right? Okay, so let me answer that. The answer is regarding the legal sanctity of the data and the contracts on the blockchain. Okay. Now, based on whoever we talk to, we have talked to several lawyers and law firms, as well as we have discussed this with World Economic Forum, industrial discussions. The fact that the data on the platform is digitally signed using a digital signature, most people believe that that is under the purview of the Indian Information Act because it's a digital signature. And as long as the government recognizes digital signature, this is just a digitally signed data, and therefore it has legal sanctity, right? As once it comes to contracts, things become slightly more tricky because the word contract becomes slightly more powerful than just data. Whether these contracts have legal sanctity in India or abroad, the answer seems to be in India that nobody knows, but at least in the US, high courts in the states have ruled in favor of legal sanctity of smart contracts, and that has not yet been challenged in the Supreme Court in the US. Okay, so that is where the legal situation is. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. But have there been any cases in India, like similar cases where have been taken?
Hey, Ranjit here, can I suggest that we continue with the session and raise this question at the end? Okay. Sunil, did you have a question? I saw you raise your hand.
I just wanted to know that if a car is there, it goes to a service provider. With this passport, can I detect which component was from which supplier so that it can be attended to much faster? You know, I would like to have in a Miko or a Dozy, when equipment is supplied, if who's the real supplier, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 in that case?
Absolutely, you can. That is one of the use cases we are working with. We are trying to push through to a manufacturing company. And Sunil, you know who I'm talking about. This is a warranty management use case where, and here is the interesting problem there. Even though 70% of the automobile parts are not manufactured by the OEM themselves, the warranty cost ends up being borne by the OEM. So the ability to trace a part that was replaced and where it came from, even though that data is available, it is partly with the supplier, partly with the manufacturer, and partly with the distributor. The idea of a product passport is that you have now given it a context and made it shared across these three entities to immediately transfer the cost of replacement to the supplier and therefore make it more auditable.
It can be now traced back to the component supplier rather than the brand.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Praful, I'm Ashokan here. The question which Sunil asked opens up a big Pandora. When it comes to telecom, for example, all these OTT players and everybody, content costs, Australian government, Facebook, you can just, everything can be traced back, and then the sharing of the booty would be a very, very clear-cut, easy task. Fantastic use case.
Yes, so this is exactly what, I mean, people now, once they get it, they get excited by the transparency that it brings in the systems. And that's exactly why, I mean, personally, I also got excited about this technology. Okay, so let me move on. What MarketSend is, it's the ability, it's a platform which allows on-demand creation of these cross-enterprise digital platforms. This is what we call B2B groups, right? Cross-enterprise digital platforms, quite a mouthful. I think people relate better to B2B groups, right? So what we do when you create a group on our platform is we create these small donuts that you see are private groups that we spin up for private blockchains. And what we have done with the NFT solution is build a bridge which connects to the public blockchains, so that any asset which is agreed upon by the parties in the private blockchain can be registered as an NFT on the public blockchain, right? And that's really the idea of Product Passport. Product Passport takes an asset from the private blockchain and pushes it to the public blockchain so that it becomes trusted, verifiable, and so on, right? MarketSend is hosted on the cloud. Right now we support AWS and we support Oracle blockchain platform. And of course, our platform is available both as a user interface and also API, so that we are already integrating with Oracle, SAP, Tally. RxSile is a TREDS platform we are integrated with, and GST Network, right? Some case studies I'll quickly.
Truffle runs only on Hyperledger?
Right now, our private blockchains run only on Hyperledger Fabric. On public blockchain side, we support both Tezos and Ethereum, and now we recently added Matic as a public blockchain support.
Okay.
Okay. Some quick use cases. One place where we have seen is one of our customers, Hindalco, who have formed a group or a cross-enterprise platform between Tier 1, Tier 2 supplier and the contract manufacturer for real-time tracking of inventory, orders, products, and invoices. The key value proposition here is reductions in cycle time of supply chains or procurement time, right? Second use case I will cite is a Chennai-based organization called Samunati, which is an agri-finance company, which is forming a group between themselves. They are the financier, corporate buyers of agri products, and FPOs, which are suppliers. And here the ability to reduce or improve the cash flow is the key value proposition between companies. The third use case I will cite is a Korean customer. They have formed a group between themselves. They're a fleet operator of electric vehicles like Uber and Ola, and they have formed a group between themselves, drivers, which are independent consultants, and bank, and they are using this as a data monetization use case where they are monetizing the data that they create by running their fleet. So some quick examples. In general, when you think about applications, and perhaps I will leave this slide on as I stop, these are different use cases that you should think of. I've supply chains, finance, and in general data or customer experience. What are the kind of things that a cross-enterprise blockchain can enable with what we call B2B groups and with enterprise NFTs? I will leave this here and open the floor for questions slightly towards the end, not too much time, but hopefully we can go 5-7 minutes post 4 o'clock if everybody's okay. Happy to answer any questions.
Hey, so I had requested somebody to postpone their question. Could that gentleman take the floor first and ask the question?
So Ranjit, yeah, it was almost about to be over. Praful, it
Sure.
was, have there been any cases where the legal sanctity of the data or the contracts have been checked in Indian courts, in Indian judicial systems, where we can have, let's say you said, right?
I'm not aware of the Indian courts, but I can connect you with a lady who is handling this topic in the World Economic Forum Industrial 4.0 Revolution from Mumbai. She is our legal consultant. I don't know that it has been challenged in Indian courts yet.
Gaurav, even if there is a challenge, the first date you will get covers the total history of blockchain period.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Hey, Praful, question I have is, what are the negatives of this? There's nothing in the world that has everything positive.
Sure. So in the public blockchain, one of the biggest complaint is energy consumption. Okay. Here also the answer is always more nuanced than a yes and no. Now the first generation blockchains that came out, which were Bitcoin and Ethereum, were extremely expensive in terms of the amount of computation they asked each node to contribute to the maintaining the shared digital ledger. And as you might have seen in the last 1 year, that has been called out as one of the big negatives of public blockchains, which is the energy consumption, and they are not environment friendly. And that statement is correct, right? However, if you look at next generation blockchains, right? For example, we support Tezos, which uses orders of magnitude less energy than the first generation blockchain. Ethereum, which is another first generation blockchain and is about to transition to its next generation, will significantly reduce the amount of electricity and computation that will require to run a public blockchain system. So for public blockchain, electricity consumption is by far the biggest negative, which is now being solved as we speak. I would also say one more line here. Please decouple blockchain and crypto in your mind, right? When it comes to crypto, there's a whole list of negatives that come into play as to what is the asset backing the value, how do you control its value. I have neither addressed those questions, nor was that the focus today, because that's a very different discussion about where does cryptocurrency derive its value from and whether it's right or wrong. So as I have answered only the blockchain part of the question, and I hope that was what you were asking.
I think one of the biggest use cases could have been vaccine distribution and verification who got the vaccine. Don't you think that?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely think that. And I would actually say that it is not a past tense thing. Even in future, if we kind of create a digital health passport for our citizens, which can be writable by different hospitals, there's a huge value proposition here that can really bring the data together. The idea that e-health records should be created has been there for a decade now. I was in HP for several years, and even 10 years ago, I was hearing e-health records. The difference here now is data ownership. So in fact, in the US, the Department of Health, NIH, actually sponsored a project where they said my health data is my data, and I should own it, and I should control who gets it. And I think there is a value proposition there. I just don't know whether the sector is ready for adopting it.
So a similar question, Praful. What are the other successful use cases on the public blockchain space apart from crypto, which has been in use or really successful? Any examples?
Right. So let me cite you the one that is one of my favorites, and Venkat recently referred to it. It is called DeFi, decentralized finance. And here is what it basically says. Okay, it says, let's suppose you want to do invoice financing, right? Invoice financing is a use case where I have two companies which are dealing in a permission blockchain, right? One party has created an invoice on the other, and the buyer says, I will pay you after 60 days. Invoice, so the supplier takes this invoice to the bank and submits the invoice as a collateral, and bank pays early, of course, for a price. That is traditional invoice financing. What is happening with DeFi is interesting solutions like this. You can take this invoice and submit it to the public blockchain, right? And borrow in cryptocurrency. So even if your invoice is worth 10 lakh rupees, you can borrow the equivalent amount in cryptocurrency. Now, why is this exciting? Well, from a supplier perspective, you suddenly have access to capital from a much larger pool of capital than any bank can have, right? Because the net value of crypto is huge. Second, why is it beneficial for the crypto holder? Well, people who are holding cryptocurrency didn't really have a way to benefit from holding that cryptocurrency, except for saying that speculatively the price of this crypto will go up. But by enabling lending of cryptocurrency against traditional digital assets, you have given them a yield by even holding that cryptocurrency, right? So I think that is perhaps the most exciting one for me, which is the DeFi revolution.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sure. So yeah, I'll leave. This was a summary which I promised to offer answers for, and the answers are on the board. Hopefully you kind of got a flavor of this, right? And I will finish with this. Another couple of minutes, we have a couple of more questions. Happy to answer them now.
Yeah, any other questions, audience?
Would you share this presentation?
Sure. I can send it to Sunil and Ranjit, and they can share as appropriate.
Yes, this is a presentation worth sharing, and a lot more needs to be understood, because these three use cases that Praful has talked about of supply chain, finance, and passport, all three are very, very unique cases. They are relevant for every company. I mean, that's what we are seeing. We partner with Praful to invest in an early stage. Inventors is another partner with them who's invested them in early on days. This use case for enterprises, for high growth companies like yours to adopt this for, particularly for your working capital needs at the right time to discount your bills, invoicing, etc., is going to one use case. Supply chain is working capital of each one of us stuck for many days or so. That can be optimized, as well as if you are able to have a passport and identity of your own products, look at the ease that it will be having in the future, authenticity of the products and how they are sourced. So these are the three use cases that Praful has already got customers, and I thought it's important for you to take note of that.